Good afternoon or good morning, students, depending on when you are viewing this podcast. This podcast is all about transport and how cells are able to maintain homeostasis and how cells are able to transport materials, substances in and out of their cells. So, if we look at just a little bit of background about cell membrane transport in general, remember cell membranes are selectively permeable. What does that mean? It just means that they are selective in what comes in and out of the cell. That's what permeable means, to allow through. Selective means, of course, that only certain things are chosen to come in and out of the cells. So what types of molecules do we need to transport across the membrane? Things like sugar, things like oxygen, things like carbon dioxide. We breathe in oxygen, they need to come into our cells. We breathe out carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide has to come through our cells. We eat food, and that food has to come into our cells. We drink water, and that water has to come in and out of our cells. So there's two different overall types of transport. The first type of transport requires no energy whatsoever, and the other type of transport does. So we'll start with the easiest one first. Passive transport requires no energy. This is a natural type of transport. This would be like if you sprayed some cologne or perfume and someone in the room smelled it. Right? Fragrances work like that. Scented candles, right? Things naturally diffuse across the room. Requires no energy to do that. Molecules want to spread out evenly, and that's called, when they're spreading out evenly, that's called moving down the concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Again, passive transport moves molecules naturally using no energy from high to low concentration until equilibrium is reached. Now, these are specific types of transport. As I mentioned before, diffusion is just the diffusion of molecules. Facilitated diffusion is when molecules need help crossing the cell membrane. And then osmosis is a special type of diffusion called, or using water. Active transport requires energy. Molecules this time are going to move in a backward fashion. They're going to go from a less crowded area to a crowded area. So if we have 100 people in the classroom, active transport would be trying to fit 102 people in the classroom, going from again, a low concentrated area to a high concentrated area. Examples of active transport are sodium potassium pumps, things like endocytosis and exocytosis. If we look at just simple diffusion, again, simple diffusion is a type of passive transport requiring no energy. This is just like if you would spray air freshener or any type of perfume or cologne. They just naturally dissipate across the room. Molecules will spread out evenly, and this happens in your cells all the time. So molecules well, backing up a bit, if we're talking about living cells, molecules diffuse through those phospholipids that we've already defined and diagrammed until they reach equilibrium. Those phospholipids are the outer part of what make up the outer part of your cell membrane. Again, they're moving, when I say they, I'm talking about molecules, are moving from high to low concentration, a crowded to less crowded. That's what high to low means. And the molecules must be small enough to pass through these proteins. They must be neutral or polar. And examples are like carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and oxygen, which we breathe in. Here's an example of passive transport and diffusion. Before, things are moving in and out, and after, things are moving in and out until equilibrium is reached. That's why you don't see the egg getting bigger or smaller, because equilibrium in diffusion is always reached. Factors that affect molecules moving in and out are temperature. As temperature increases, right, molecules speed up and move, so diffusion is going to increase as well. The concentration of molecules, as concentration on the inside or on one side of the membrane increases, diffusion will also increase. And the size of molecules. Smaller molecules have an easier time diffusing across the cell membrane because they're moving through these protein channels, which we have already defined in our last PowerPoint. If we look at passive transport, facilitated diffusion, Facilitated diffusion is a special type of transport, and again, we're going to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration, crowded to less crowded. Molecules that are large or polar just need some help crossing the membrane, and so they're going to use transport proteins, or for instance, things like glucose or sodium. And the transport type of transport protein is a carrier protein, right? It's like Pac-Man, right? Pac-Man is that carrier protein. It goes out and gobbles something out on the outside of the cell and brings it in. Channel proteins are just tunnels. Right? They're much like aquaporins, which we'll see in a minute, but they're just tunnels to move things in and out. Here's an example of a carrier protein right here, letter B, and letter A is an example of a transport protein. You see the tunnel here, and you see the Pac-Man device here with the carrier protein. Osmosis. Osmosis is a special type of passive transport, moving water in and out of your cells. It's all about the diffusion of water from high to low concentration, crowded to less crowded. Here's an example where you see water moving across the membrane here until equilibrium is reached. Right? And this water, we used to think just would go through the cell membrane on its own, but they actually go through these tiny little proteins called aquaporins. And this was just a recent finding of how water gets in and out of your cells. So here's a before picture and here's an after picture. If you look, water actually is leaving the cell, causing it to shrink. That can be a problem because the cell that can eventually lead to cell death. And that is the movement of water when too much water is moving in and out. This situation where too much water is moving in and out is called a hypertonic concentration. This is when the solute, something like salt, is higher on the outside of the cell than on the inside. So the water wants to move out to equal that balance out. And again, cell size is going to decrease in the aftermath. Right? The concentration of solute is higher on the outside than on the inside. So water is going to move out to try and equalize that. Hypotonic is just the opposite. Here you start off with the before, and then the after you get bigger. This is where the solute is lower on the inside than on the outside, so water is going to move in to try and equalize that. And this way the cell size is going to increase. Chances are that these look like eggs, of course, and we're doing the egg lab right now, so you're going to see some of this happening. The third type of osmosis is called isotonic. And if we have one type of osmosis that water moves out, one type where water moves in, this type we have solution the same on the inside and out, so water is going to move in and out at the same rate. The cell is going to stay the same size. So here's another example, just a little graphic of water moving in, that's hypotonic. Water moving out, that's hypertonic. And you have in both directions, that's isotonic. So this is what happens in animal cells. If too much water comes in, you're going to have a lysine involved. Your cell explodes. Isotonic, it's normal. And in the hypertonic, your cell is going to shrivel up and die. In plant cells, we have water that too much water comes in. It's called turgidity. It's where the plant gets a little more stiff. Flaccid means that it's normal, and plasmolyzed means when the cell is going to shrivel up and die. This would be like your plants on a hot day that are shriveling up that you can just tell are dehydrated. That's what plasmolyzed means. The last type of transport, again, is active. Remember, we have passive transport, which requires no energy, and we're talking about diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. And then we have active transport that requires energy. This time we're going to move from a low to high concentration, a less crowded area to a crowded area. Why would we want to do that? Well, sometimes we need sodium and potassium and other ions to cross the cell membrane even into a crowded area. So this does require energy. Requires transport proteins to do that. Some are considered proton pumps, like this picture. It's just pumping in hydrogen ions. Here are some examples of the pump and sucrose transport. Sucrose is a type of sugar. So these are proteins set in the cell membrane that are going to help move things from a low to high concentration. Let's skip to the last page because we have two scenarios here that are going to be involved in bulk transport of bringing stuff in or taking stuff out. Endocytosis, endo meaning in, cytosis meaning cell. So we're talking about moving things in the cell. This is where something called a vesicle, and you can see the picture here, it's just a little vesicle that is made from phospholipids, and they're going to draw something in. And this is something like a white blood cell engulfing bacteria to get rid of it. Here's a nice microscope slide of endocytosis. So if you're sick with a bacterial infection, then, well, your white blood cells are engulfing, they're using endocytosis to engulf that bacteria. The second part of the bulk transport, active transport, is exocytosis. And this is when you want to expel something, when you want to get rid of it. And vesicles burst, releasing molecules out of the cell. This is where your white blood cells would release the digestive remains of the bacteria. So your white blood cells would engulf the bacteria, digest it, kill it, and then spit it out. That would be exocytosis. So these are all the parts of slice number 7, cell membrane and transport. Please make sure you have these notes and put them in your binder and ask Mr. Matthews with any questions.